Yoicks. Hello and welcome to the Hackaday podcast. I'm Elliot Williams, editor-in-chief of Hackaday.
And I'm Dan Maloney. I'm a staff writer at Hackaday.com and community engineer at Hackaday.io.
This is episode 158. Today we'll be talking about phased array physics, CRTs two ways, a microcontroller, and a surgically implanted red herring. Dan has been writing a bunch of chemistry articles lately, and I think that's been really fun to read, and actually we talked about it last week on the show. And just today I saw a new Nile Red video, Dan, that made me think of you.
This is the gloves, right?
Yeah, the gloves, yes. So in Dan's last article, he kind of traced through the synthesis of wintergreen and started out at basically the wellhead and its petrochemicals all the way along. A bunch of people in the comments, of course, said, this reminds me of a Nile Red video. And I turn around, and what is this video? It's him slicing up plastic gloves and trying to extract some chemical that he can turn into a capsaicin, like a hot sauce ingredient.
That's a recent one. And then he did the grape flavoring, which is some sort of anthracene or something like that. I forget what it was that you could get from the vinyl gloves. And I guess it's one of the plasticizers or something that they use in the gloves. And he drank it as soda, like he made a grape soda out of it. And he said, yeah, okay, it tastes like grape. And the same thing with the hot sauce. He keeps doing these things and he keeps not dying. So I guess he's doing it right.
Yeah, I mean, at some level, I understand that everything is made out of atoms. And if you rearrange the atoms, you can turn them into different things. And cyanide is made out of atoms and butter is made out of atoms. And I understand this, but doing the reactions to go from one to the other is still a little bit mystifying to me. And that's actually... that kind of flavor is what I thought was really cool about that wintergreen article where you went from, phenols and they branch off to aspirin. And if they take the left turn, they branch off and turn into artificial wintergreen flavoring. Yeah,
that was a fun one to write because as I was having this discussion with my wife about, well, where does artificial wintergreen come from? And why do you need artificial wintergreen when we grow trees that have that flavor in them? I just sort of followed it all the way back from methyl salicylate and then back to salicylic acid and back and back and back. And I kept as the further back I went, the more clear it became as this stuff comes out of the ground as oil and 100%. So like, okay, well, that's pretty artificial. Go have yourself a lifesaver.
It's to the point where it's easier to heat up a bunch of chemicals to, a bazillion degrees at a bazillion atmospheres than it is to go out into the forest and scrape the bark off of willow trees or whatever.
Yeah, and it's kind of amazing that's the case. Plants are such good biochemistry labs. They do so much stuff. They store so many compounds in their biomass. It's just so hard to get some of them out, and it just makes it easier to look past all of that extra stuff that gets that scaffolding that all these compounds hang on in the form of cellulose and lignin and all planty woody bits, and then they just say, okay, fine, let's get rid of that. Let's just get down to basic principles. This thing is the simple molecule. I know where I can get that. Let's go drill a hole in the ground and build up a whole infrastructure around it, and it makes sense, but it's scary in a way because this is all stuff we're still going to need when we don't need gasoline anymore. And that's kind of why I wrote that article about fuels and, the fact that gasoline, it's a component of crude oil that doesn't go away. You can't turn it into something else. If you don't need it anymore, you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do with that stuff. Maybe you could turn it into wintergreen and we'll all have, minty fresh breath as we drive around in our EVs.
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound? What's that sound?
All right, it's time for What's That Sound? I was playing some retro video games and stumbled across an old favorite of mine. So if you've been playing with the RetroPie lately, you may be able to name this sound.
I've not seen such bravery. Valkyrie needs food badly.
This one I don't remember.
No?
The synthesized voice there.
Isn't that fantastic?
It's awesome, and I love the whole 8-bit sort of vibe there.
It's actually really awesome music if you listen to the whole thing.
Yeah, I kind of hear that chicking sound like Mario hitting the coins or whatever, but I don't know. Something along those lines.
All right, well, if you out there listening do know this video game, let me know what it is. You can enter your best guess and the handle that you'd like to be called on the air over at hackaday.com/podcast. Next week, we'll pick from among the right answers, and the lucky winner will get a Hackaday Podcast t-shirt. My first hack this week is a Twitter tweet that was tipped off to us by Cedric. New part day, smallest ARM MCU uproots competition / needs research. This was really interesting, I think mostly because of the discussion it sparked in the comments section. The part in question is kind of a normal-ish, run-of-the-mill, small microcontroller. It's not particularly interesting, except that it is absolutely tiny. This is a little BGA part, 16-pin BGA, but it is 1.6 millimeters by 1.4 millimeters wide. And for those of you in imperial units, that's just really, really small. It's incredibly small ball grid array part. It's a 0.35 millimeter pitch on the balls on the underside, which is, I worked this out, that's 14 thou. And the balls are, of course, 0.2 millimeters wide. It ends up being basically a 5 thou gap between the balls that you have to run your traces out through, or drill down with super tiny drills to get through the board and fan them out that way. What's funny about this is that this is really on the edge of the doable for kind of the hacker home gamer. And that was what was interesting in the comments, was the discussion of people who are like, oh my God, you'll never be able to do this, to, oh my God, you will be able to do this, you just have to really work with your board house to do it. And then, of course, you have that guy, and that guy in this question is the Gribbs, who comes in with photos of a hand-soldered, similar pitch ball grid array part that he has put wires to. And, I mean, yeah, kudos.
I saw this article, and I looked at the feature image. I'm looking at it, and I'm like, what are they talking about? I mean, I don't see anything. It literally took me a couple of seconds to find the part on the board. You know, that's an MCU. Okay. Wow. I mean, there's unpopulated pads there on the board that are significantly bigger. And I don't know what part that, it almost looks like it's for a crystal or something like that. And the pads are significantly bigger. And yet somehow this part managed to be, handleable. Yeah, you're right. That makes it even weirder to see someone soldering magnet wire onto the back of one of those parts. At some point, you got to ask yourself, what are you accomplishing other than flex?
Yeah, I don't know. I just think it's fantastic that you can get full microcontrollers with, like 16K of flash and 2K, 4K of RAM on board that will run, actual programs you put into the thing, and they are about as big as the decoupling capacitors that you need to run them. Like, it's really mind-blowing.
There's no documentation to speak of here, at least not in English. And even though there's a button on the website to switch to English, it just links back to the same document, so it all stays in Chinese. So whoever was working with this either had to understand Chinese or kind of figured it out just from what he could glean from the data sheet. I wasn't clear. Was this dev board here? Was this something that Cedric came up with, or was it something?
No, it's not. He was just linking it. The dev board is made by LilyGo. It's a professionally produced board, and they must have the kind of relationship with their PCB house that they can get these sort of things made, no questions asked. It did get me thinking that I need to step up my ball grid array game and try my hand at like something funny like this. And if you want to do that, a part like this may actually be the perfect starting point because it is 16 pins. And so if you think about it, it's like a 4x4 array which means the lines that are really hard to bring out to the outside are only those 4 that are on the like inside little square. So it's not a horrible problem to fan these out. And so if you're going to get started doing the hard stuff, this may be a good, like, easy way into the hard stuff. And I should probably step up my game to some ball grid arrays. I remember ages ago when I used to be scared of surface mount parts. And, if I can manage to do it, I don't use any through-hole components anymore. So maybe ball grid is maybe that's my next level up.
Yeah, and this chip in particular, at $1 a piece, quantity 1, if you sneeze and lose it, okay, My first pick this week is going to be from Emily Velasco. Pulling off a CRT transplant doesn't have to be tricky. Lewin Day wrote this one. This one kind of got me because my first job out of high school was to work in a TV shop, a TV repair shop. And this was
cool.
This was back in the days of, console TVs and big, everything was tube, obviously. The dark days for any customer who walked in with a TV that was, or more likely that we went and picked up, because that was 90% of the job for me, was schlepping big, heavy TVs down the stairs of walk-ups. Bring those into the shop, go over it, and the dark day would be, I'm sorry, it needs a picture tube. And it was kind of like, saying, oh, I'm sorry, your husband needs a heart transplant or something like that. People were just devastated by that. It's funny, too, because we did pretty much exactly what Emily did here, which was harvest a picture tube or CRT from another device. We used to do that all the time. We'd find, we'd take TVs and trade, and if we had an exact match or something that was close, we would just pick the picture tube out of that and put it into the other chassis. That's kind of what she did here, except the donor for this, to getting this little purple, blobby looking, bubbly looking TV going again, the donor tube came from a fish finder from the 80s. There's an amber monochrome CRT that happened to be a good match physically, size-wise, and the pinout was close and all that. So she actually managed to get this TV running again. The picture's all black and amber, I guess it would be, instead of black and white. It's got this whole 90s, 80s, 2000s, whatever vibe to it that made it a fun project. And it's also a little bit of a trip down memory lane in terms of the picture tube replacements that we used to do. In the comments, someone took her to task for this bizarre, bubbly looking TV that she was playing with. And she said, I just wanted to get the TV part of that working, the circuitry working. It's actually going to go into another case. So there's going to be yet another thing that this whole thing goes into.
This is just part 1 of a yet crazier art project. That makes me totally happy.
Yeah, no, and Emily, it's going to be weird.
Yeah, that's perfect. Well, then I feel better. Now I could sleep at night as long as she's not going to be watching videos on it. It's fine by me. All right, I had to feature this next hack because it's one of the best demonstrations of some neat physics I've seen in a long time. This is a video by BitLooney, Bend It Like Sonar Beacon with a phased array. And ostensibly the video is about him building a phased array audio sonar device, but really it's a secret discussion of him learning about and playing around with phased arrays. And the thing I really love about it is that he does this demo where he just has a pool of water and he sticks his finger into it to make ripples. And then he sticks 2 fingers in and you can watch the wavefronts cancel. But he doesn't leave it there, because to do better beamforming with a phased array, you need a whole bunch, not just 2 fingers, but many, many fingers. And they have to dip into the water with precise offset in time relative to each other. And so he actually builds a finger dipper machine out of a bunch of solenoids and has them go tack, 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 tack. And then you can actually watch kind of a single wavefront move away at an angle off to the left and off to the right. He's got a computer simulation of it that he's actually put up on shadertoy.com that you can play around with, like the number of microphones and their spacing from each other, and you can steer the beam left and right. It's really cool and gives you a very intuitive feeling for kind of the invisible physics that's going on behind all this. One way to figure out how the sound intensity patterns go are to like move a microphone through the field of the sound coming out of this phased array and see where it's loudest and where it's quietest. And so he actually takes a pick and place machine and straps a microphone onto it and like moves it back and forth across this whole field and plots that out. What I love about all of these different demos is that some of them are very intuitive, some of them are written in code and are very precise. One of them's just full out experimental where he's moving the microphone around on the pick and place, but they all kind of converge to the same result. And they have to, and it's really great that they do. But it kind of gives you the feeling for why you'd want to simulate some of this stuff, because that's easier, and then why you'd want to do experimental work on it. And it's so nice to see all of these different worlds come together in one video. Oh, and he makes a nice little phased array sonar thing.
Yeah, that was sort of an afterthought in some ways to the demonstration in the learning part of it. Take like something like Starlink, the Starlink dish. What do they call it? Dishy McDish face or something like that. Whatever the antenna. Right. When you have a mechanical dish, like like the old satellite dishes that used to, the big 2-meter diameter ones or whatever they were that actually had to steer to track a satellite. You could tell how that worked. Obviously, just by looking at it, it's in a different position. It's pointing at a different satellite. That makes sense. Then you kind of step up to the phase array and someone explains, well, if you control the phase of these, it kind of moves the beam off, and there's a little hand waving there. And you're just like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. The antenna doesn't move, and yet the signal forms a beam. Yeah, sure. Okay. That makes sense. But, you don't really capture it in your head until you see something like this. Yeah. It's sound, yes. It's not radio, but the analogy is the same. The physics are the same with the way the constructive and destructive interference virtually moves the beam around. And demos like this really are handy. The thing that I think of that we covered once was a demonstration on how the Yagi antenna works and how that actually manages to use constructive and destructive interference in the same sort of way to create a very directional beam. It's not steerable unless you physically steer the antenna, but it's still the same thing, and it's kind of along these same lines. There was also a visualization in the article that I wrote on the Yagi antenna that really explains how those interference patterns form the directional beam.
Anyway, this video is chock full of interesting physics, but it also has a GitHub that has his code for making this phased sonar array on it. He's also got the PCB up there. You can make one of these yourself. It's all powered by an ESP32. The software is actually remarkably approachable if you go have a look at it. And then the video is just full of awesome demonstration after awesome demonstration. So if you're into doing this kind of phased array thing on your own, the budget is there. Like, it's not very expensive. The code's there for you. This should inspire you to do it. Oh, and extra points for BitLooney for citing a Hackaday SuperCon talk for his introduction into phased arrays. I put the link for that in too.
My next pick is 90s PC with modern parts throws many off track. Brian Cockfield wrote this one up. It was based on a video from Shank, who's a case modder. He managed to find a few of these precious
horrible
cases from the 90s. I guess Mattel actually came up with a branded PC case. They came up with one for boys, one for girls. The boys case was based on the Hot Wheels line of little model cars. The girl side was based on the Barbie line. The video mostly features the modifications that he did to this Hot Wheels case, which is really cool, actually. It's a very small form factor PC. Even at the time, it probably was a pretty cheap PC that went more for the branding than for the performance under the hood. Kind of literally under the hood too, since they went with the Hot Wheels branding. It's got a flame job on the side, and it's got the blue color that the Hot Wheels brand was big into at the time, Hot Wheels logo. And it ran a lot of software that was based on the Hot Wheels universe, I guess. Anyways, this case is now available to him, and rather than just leave it as the original guts, he decides he's going to clear it out and do a sleeper gaming PC build inside of this case. And he managed to squeeze an incredible amount of stuff inside of this case without too many modifications. You might beg to differ on that, looking at a case that has wheels and an exhaust pipe and a spoiler on it. But those are just little, that's greebling for
cosmetic.
Although it's kind of cool that the pipe actually works and this PC can roll coal. That might actually be the case. It might actually start smoking because the heat generated by the stuff that he put in there, including an RTX 3060 graphics card, all that stuff, and the Ryzen CPU as well. Put a couple of billion transistors inside a case from a time when there was at least an order of magnitude less transistors, and you're going to have a heat management problem. So what does he do? Rather than just use the original vents, he puts in this monstrous, ridiculous fan. Like he said, when he turned it on, it sounded like a leaf blower, and it does. It sounds like it's 11,000 RPMs, moving air at just incredible velocities, and it gets the job done, but at the expense of absolutely not being able to hear anything that's going on in the game. The funny thing is that he'd been looking for one of these Hot Wheel cases for a long time, and Linus managed to go on a podcast or vlog or something like that and say he would pay $5,000 for one of these Hot Wheel cases. And that ruined the market for these things. They're not particularly rare. They're out there. A lot of them were made. People have them sitting in their garages and whatnot, but then they heard this. And like, well, if this guy's willing to pay $5,000, everybody's willing to pay $5,000. So now everything from the Hot Wheels line is unobtainium, and unless you've got a pretty big checkbook. But he did manage to get this one and get it done. It's a lot of fun to look at what he managed to stuff in there.
Sometimes the hacks you read on Hackaday hit close to home, and this is one that really did it for me. Raphael has a write-up of his problems making soil moisture sensors, and this post is called Soil Moisture Sensor Coding Lessons Learned the Hard Way. If you're triggered by pictures of rusted PCBs, do not look at this post, because there is nothing worse than the moist and sometimes acidic and just kind of dirty environment that's inside a plant pot that you subject a moisture sensor to. This is a really neat post. It's multiple years of experience trying to make one of those capacitive soil moisture sensors to put in your plants so that you can know when you need to water them. You can buy these online, cheap everywhere. If they're not sealed on the edges, what happens is the water creeps up under. And if you do seal them on the edges, what happens is the water creeps in through the silk screen and it eats the copper and the board comes undone and you're done. Raphael tried all the obvious things. He tried putting nail polish on it, which didn't work at all. He coated some in conformal coating, which worked pretty well, except he found that when he hung them to dry, there was a little blob on the conformal coating, and that actually made a thick part that got pushed off after repeatedly putting the moisture probe into the dirt, pulling it out, putting it in, pulling it out. And that made a weak spot where water got in. He built a 3D printed rotisserie for drying these things so that when he did the conformal coating, it wouldn't get a blobby on it. And that, in the end, was his solution. This is a great one to look at the comments, though. Myceus is his name, Catnip Electronics. He says he's tested all of these out, and the best solution he's come up with is a 2-part epoxy spread on really thin. It makes it absolutely indestructible, but it's also super expensive and very hard to do, so he just goes with a polyurethane spray. I've experimented around with using sticks of graphite. They were pencil leads, actually, because they don't rust in principle, but what does happen is that as they get wet and dry out, the calcium in the water sticks to the sides of them, and they change their properties slowly over time too, as they calc up from the hard water we've got here, I guess. This may or may not be your problem. It's definitely mine. I have been thwarted by plant moisture sensors, and I'm glad to see I'm not alone.
Just to play devil's advocate here, I haven't built any of these, so I don't know the answer to this, but I wonder if part of the problem here is the desire to make this a monolithic sort of build. So just you're going to use the PCB both as a substrate to build your circuit on, and it's going to be the sensor. Maybe this is just a limit of deciding on that, and maybe you should be fine with that. Like, okay, it's a consumable now, basically. And it's just going to have to be replaced every couple of years or every season or something like that. Maybe that's one solution to it. Maybe the other solution is kind of like what you said with the graphite electrodes. Maybe it's just you just accept the fact that the circuit's going to go on the PCB and the sensors is going to be something else. Maybe it's stainless steel wires that get attached to the board. Maybe it's, like it's graphite, like you said. Maybe it's something else entirely. Do screw terminals on the end of the PCB, and you just replace them every once in a while. Kind of like you would do with electrodes on a little spot welder or something like that. They're going to be degraded over time, so make it just so you can replace them.
Yeah, I think that's actually the right solution entirely. And there's a problem here that anything that's sitting there in the dirt and getting watered all the time and kept moist is just going to go bad.
You can minimize it perhaps, but you can never win. Water always finds a way.
Epoxy. Maybe epoxy. Maybe I'll do one more. Maybe I'll do one more run with epoxy. I've actually just given up, and I have found that just watering the plants on a timer is just about as good. And it takes you a while to get it tuned in to like what the optimal on time is. But I have entirely given up on sensing the water level in any of my plants. And I just hit them with enough water and check them every once in a while. And when it looks like it's too much, I'll tone it down. Boo.
Okay, my last pick is surgically implanted Bluetooth devices don't help would-be exam cheats by Jenny List. And unfortunately, or fortunately maybe, we don't have anyone to blame this on. There's no names mentioned in the story. Basically what the story is that a pair of students at Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Medical College in India were caught trying to cheat on one of their exams using what the article describes as surgically implanted Bluetooth devices. Now, I read the original article, and there's not a whole lot of there. There might also be a translation issue there. I wasn't entirely clear if the original article was written in English or not, but basically what it came down to was that these two students were caught during an exam with some sort of tech on them. They had some sort of Bluetooth headphones that were linked. I guess the two setups were different for the two different students, but one of them had a cell phone and was somehow using this to have answers fed to him. Were they collaborating, with each other somehow, or copying answers? I think Jenny hit the right tone here with this story, turning a skeptical eye, or ear in this case, to what's going on here, especially with the surgically implanted angle that they played up big time here in the story. I take it as a matter of faith that people will put massive amounts of work into finding ways to avoid massive amounts of work. The one possible thing that might make sense is that they had some sort of bone conducting implant put at the back of their head or something like that something that would actually, touch the bones of the skull and be able to transmit sound that way. But even then, that seems like a long way to go. And I'm sure I don't want either one of these guys as my doctor. So let's just leave it at that.
I love the layers of crazy schemes that everyone comes up with in the comments on this one, though. I think I agree with you and Jenny that this is what probably happened is entirely pedestrian, and they got a hearing aid, basically a Bluetooth powered hearing aid size thing, and they got it stuck in their ear. Probably was small enough that it could fit in their ear canal. I mean, hearing aids are like that these days, but I don't think it was anything surgical, and I think that's where it went wrong. But then, of course, I love everybody in the comments who's like, oh, this would be cool. And everybody's coming up with even crazier ways to cheat in high school exams than the other. And so Filet Mignon comes in with, I made an induction coil necklace and magnetic earpiece in high school. I mean, there's all these great. I think that is the coolest part of the story, is not that these guys put a hearing aid in their ears to cheat, but it's like all the crazy ideas of how you could cheat. I remember when thinking up crazy awesome ways to cheat was more interesting than, memorizing the amendments to the Constitution or something in history class. My first quick hack this week is Mike's 3D printed mechanical contraption shows live weather forecast. If you've always wanted to make an automaton but never had any idea why you would do this, this video provides you the answer. It's an automated weather forecaster that swings the sun around when it's going to be sunny and tilts the cloud out so that it can put little raindrops in it. I particularly like it has a partly cloudy symbol where the petals of the sun kind of fold out around behind the cloud. It's just a nice, simple automaton that has more motors in it than you would think are necessary. Next up, Lucas Duel. Old portable TV becomes unique CRT cyber deck. It's funny, we were talking about Emily Velasco's CRT project. This one is a portable TV turned into a Raspberry Pi computer. It's got a lot of lovely details, like where you plug in the keyboard, and it's got a tiny little trackpad on it. All of this runs on a 12-volt, previously portable CRT screen TV in all of its low-resolution glory. And last up, if you want to go the other extreme in TVs, Matt of DIY Perks has taken a 4K TV and set it up with a super bright backlight so that he could watch it outside. This LED backlight is so bright that it needs water cooling to keep it from burning out. The neatest thing that came out of the comments section here, though, is that other people have designed outdoor use TVs that use mirrors and collect the sun's own light to use as the backlighting. It makes me think about all sorts of other crazy ways that you could backlight LCD screens. And if you're like me, you probably have a couple sitting around just waiting to be taken apart.
Okay, for my quick hacks this week, I'm just noticing that I've got a theme here, and I'll tell you what the theme is at the end.
Ooh.
The first one is better kerf cuts with a CNC bit. This is by Jarmade, and he's come up with a clever way to make bent wood look a little better using a different kind of bit. Normally, kerf bending is done with a dado blade or multiple cuts from some sort of straight router bit. And it ends up leaving these gaps that don't look particularly good. This better way involves using a 6.2 degree taper carving bit, engraving bit that's used normally with a CNC router. In this case, I believe he's using a hand router, but this could easily work with a CNC setup too. And it closes up the gaps in the wood and makes for very nice looking bent wood shelves in this case. The next one is Split Flap Display Tells Us the Word. This project's by Eric Steiger. I'm looking at it as the ultimate guide to building split flap displays. Here he's got 20 modular displays all put together. They are built mostly from laser cut MDF pieces, and the detail in the original article is incredible. The step-by-step instructions are there for you. If you want to build a split flap display, this is the place where you go. He's even gone so far as to do sound tests on materials to see what sounds best when it flips over, and it's not aluminum. Those are a little too clanky. And finally, need to probe circuits? Remember about clothespins. This comes about from Henry York's attempt to find something to use to probe a pretty small circuit that he was working on. Couldn't come up with anything off the shelf. For some reason he had clothespins lying around, the old wooden clothespins with the springs. And so with application of some magnets, a little bit of a 3D printed part to keep everything aligned, a scrap of PC board, and the needle that's used to clean out a 3D printer extruder, he came up with these little tiny spring-loaded jigs that did a great job making contact with the pads that he needed to test. Anybody can make these from stuff that's just lying around. And the theme, obviously, is wood. All these projects had wood either as a material or as a tool. And it only works if you consider MDF wood, which is a stretch, but it is a wood product.
Is it more glue or is it more wood?
And it's got the power of phenol in there.
Exactly. That brings us to our can't miss articles. These are long-form original articles written by our wonderful Hackaday writing staff. And I'd like to start off with Lewin Day's "You Can Find Military Radars on Publicly Available Satellite Data." This was a really cool discovery by Oliver Ballinger at Bellingcat that the Sentinel-1A and 1B satellites are useful for discovering ground-based radar systems. So what's going on here? These are synthetic aperture radar satellites that orbit around the Earth, and as the Earth turns around underneath them, map the Earth's features. The point is that these satellites, when they pass over radar sources on the ground, get blinded by them momentarily. And because these are synthetic aperture radar satellites, they get blinded in strips. Synthetic aperture radar is the idea that if you take a whole bunch of little pictures, you can stitch them together into a big picture. And so synthetic aperture radar satellites work by passing a thin beam perpendicular to their direction of travel across the Earth, and then putting all these slices together to make an image. And what happens when they pass over a radar source on the ground is they send their radio waves down at the Earth, and instead of getting the weak reflected signal back, they get essentially blinded by whatever is on the ground. And this can be anything from military equipment. Some of the examples here are like Patriot missile batteries, but also things like weather radars down on the Earth all blind these science geography satellites as they're going across. And what's really cool is that if they go across the same signal twice in a row, it actually makes these very graphic looking X's where the X like literally marks the spot. The fun part about this is that these satellites' real purpose is up there to do long-term geological studies and environmental and ecological studies. And so they're going around the Earth every few days, imaging the whole darn thing. And you can use this for geology, you can use this for, like, they're sensitive enough in determining the height of things on the ground that they can tell when there's been an earthquake how the Earth is shifted, even if it's only a couple centimeters underneath, and they pass over frequently enough that you can see it right after it's happened. They can measure foliage in forests. There are all sorts of kind of scientific, geological, and ecological uses for these things. But the funny part here is that it turns out they also expose earthbound radar emitters.
Synthetic aperture radar, the concepts sort of just don't gel with me. Actually, until right now, and I think I've had an epiphany. I kind of think that it's similar to the optical phenomenon that I've noticed. I've got a fence in my backyard that I built a couple of years ago, and slowly over the years, the gaps between the boards are increasing as the boards shrink. So we're getting these little tiny gaps, and if you put your eye right up to it, you could see in my neighbor's yard, and you could see what's going on there. If you stand back from the fence, you don't really see that, but as you walk past the fence with your eyes turned that way, as you pass each individual crack in the fence, you get a short, small, narrow version of the optical slice of my neighbor's yard. And as you walk past it, you're seeing the next one and the next one and the next one. And I kind of think that's the way synthetic aperture radar works. You're getting these narrow slices of a view. In this case, it's in the radio spectrum, not in the optical spectrum. That's my impression of how it works. And I can see how that would then lead to being blinded. Like if my neighbor were standing in his yard and decided to shine a flashlight at one particular crack in the fence, it would not ruin, but it would cause an artifact in my vision. The persistence of vision thing would sort of stitch this bright flash in. And so I can see how this works. And then, you take it that step further to put this up in space and then have a couple of passes in different directions. X marks the spot where these military radars are. Fascinating artifact of how this works. Makes me think maybe that the militaries might want to pay attention to this.
I bet you $1 million they already are.
Oh, I'm sure. This has to be something that they've noticed already, and obviously they don't care in this particular instance for whatever reason. It's not a, it's not a military issue to them for some reason. But the fact that that you can, in publicly available data, you can pull up 2 passes of satellite and put a big X, and at the center of that X is where that battery is, or that radar set is. That's got to be a huge problem certainly for the guy who's running the radar and sitting in the middle of that big X.
Because the Sentinel satellites are all kind of meant to be a public resource in the first place, you can find out where they are at any given time. And so if you were really worried about someone finding your Patriot missiles, you could just turn the radar off for the few seconds that the Sentinel satellites are going overhead. Like, it should be easy to stay off of this radar if you want to. Or maybe this is all news to the collective world's militaries and they're going to freak out. I don't know.
Whoops.
Yeah, right? The hacker in me wonders just how sensitive these things are and how much it would take to paint my own pictures on these. Like, this is probably bad for science, but imagine taking a radar source and just pointing it up every time the satellite goes overhead. You could make your own stripes. And, if you got together with some friends, you could all make stripes that would spell something out. Who's going to put the pixelated Jolly Rancher up on these satellites for us? Do not do it. Do not do it. That was a joke. But
lots of used microwaves by the side of the road, Not saying.
Oh yeah, right? What band is this in? It's probably
it says C-band,
which is 4 to 8 gigahertz. No, your microwave oven isn't going to do it. I'm afraid you're going to need something bigger. Anyway, if you want to dig into this, we have links to the Sentinel projects, and you can download their data as it comes in. And they've actually got a really neat API if you want to play around with this stuff. I don't know. I have no idea why you'd want to check out a reasonably high-resolution height map of your neighborhood at, weekly
Why
frequency.
wouldn't you?
But I think I kind of do. Yeah, right?
Yeah,
you could check out... Is the lake running high or is it running low right now? You could go find out. It should be easy to do. Has there been, an avalanche up in the mountains outside of here? I could go check, just do differences between data sets. And there are actually super examples of academics doing this sort of stuff to kind of track weather phenomena. So cool satellite resource. This is yet one of the other weird applications of it.
Okay, my can't miss article this week is also by Lewin Day. So good job on him for running this this part of the board. Ask Hackaday, what's your worst soldering job? I'll just share the dirty little secret of Ask Hackaday articles. They're a lot of fun to write, at least from my point of view, and they're also really easy to write. because you're basically crowdsourcing the article. The article is really in a lot of ways in the comments, and you just need to set it up so that people understand what you're asking and then turn them loose. But it ends up being very interesting because we get a lot of war stories, especially with something like this. His basic premise here is that soldering is a very basic process that we all got to figure out at some time or another as we work through our lives as hackers. It's easy to lose track of the fact that it's not the easiest thing to do in the world. If you've been doing it since you've been 7 years old, or whatever, like I was when I first started soldering, then you've kind of lost touch with the early phase where you couldn't figure things out, where it wasn't going right and your solder joints looked atrocious at first and fell apart, and or maybe you're just burning yourself or burning something else. It was the learning curve is a lot steeper than you think it is when you're coming from nothing, and getting in touch with those soldering fails that we've all got in our lives is good, because it kind of puts that into perspective when you're trying to pass on your skills to someone else. It gives you a little bit of sympathy and empathy for the person who's learning how to do this. I've got two soldering stories. One was the model railroad that I got when I was young. I don't know, I was probably 7 or 8 years old or something like that. I didn't yet have a lot of skills in soldering. My dad was helping me put this thing together. His only skill with soldering at that point had been copper pipe for plumbing. And you use a torch for that. To his credit, he knew that you weren't going to use a propane torch to solder wires to the rails of a model railroad. So he came up with a sort of an impromptu soldering iron by getting a nail and holding it with a pair of pliers, heating that up in the propane torch, and then using that as a soldering iron. And I think we probably used acid core solder because that was all we had. But that's actually one of the mistakes that someone spoke about in the comments, I believe. And since Lewin kind of mentioned it a little bit in the article, he said whipping up a crucial audio cable backstage might just save a gig. That kind of reminded me of one story that I had. I used to do local crew on music, concert venues and stuff like that. And one of them was Stevie Ray Vaughan. Their show came through and he had a legendary guitar technician. This guy was the guy who kept Stevie Ray Vaughan's guitars running, which was a tough job because he had some very specific needs for guitars. Anyway, so we were doing this concert, and all of a sudden in the middle of things, an amp blows up, releases the magic smoke all over the place. I've never seen a person work so smoothly and efficiently, but quickly at the same time to take that amp out, put a new amp in. They had like a bunch of hot swappable ones that could just go right back in. The band never really even knew that anything happened except for the puff of smoke. And then he took this thing, tore it apart, fixed whatever it was. It was probably a capacitor. I don't know. He had all his tools. His soldering iron was already warmed up. Bim, bam, boom. And he was done and put that rack back into the hot swap position for the next time that one of the amps blew, which with Stevie Ray Vaughan was fairly frequently. And just being able to watch the solder heroics or the just general electronic heroics was really cool at the time to watch that process and the amount of skill that the guy brought to the job. He did the same thing when he did restring a guitar after Stevie broke strings. He was constantly breaking strings, and watching him work was almost better than the show itself. Of course, I was not really being paid to enjoy the show at that point. I was being paid to work it, and watching this whole process, the whole process of rock and roll, and how these shows work was quite an education for me back then.
I love this article for all of the horror stories too. Like, I share probably 50% of people's horror stories here. Have I had a piece of solder hit me in the eye? No. Have I had a little piece of solder hit me in the cheek? Yes. And gotten a nasty little burn off of that. Do I have solder right now on my feet? Yes, I do, because I'm German, and we have these funny, well, I've become German, and we have these funny, like, wool house shoes that we wear around inside, right? When you need to get a lot of pins off, like a multi-pin through-hole part, one of the horrible ways to do it is to just drag a pool of solder on there and go back and forth with the iron so that all of the pins get melted at the same time, and then you whack it, right? And so then you can get it all out at the same time. And of course, when you whack it, molten solder goes everywhere, including on your 100% wool German house shoes. And so, like, as I talk to you, I have a solder splash on my shoe. The nice thing about, wool felt is that it's super not heat conductive, and it didn't burn through and scorch my foot like apparently it did with some other people's examples here where they got solder and burns through a pair of jeans or whatever. Ouch, I can imagine.
Yeah.
But I'll throw in a video series actually made by the Pace Soldering. I guess they make soldering electronics and instruction courses. I'll send a video in there. It's really good. There's actually a whole bunch of useful tips in this series. It's like 10 videos long. You will spend, it's narrated by Mr. 1960s too, so it's really kind of fun. There's all those things about soldering, like when it's right, it should make this little fillet and stuff like that. But they go through like 10 or 15 different ways to critique your soldering job, and just that alone is worth thinking about. And if you want to see solder nightmare stories, you should go through the comments here too. There's no shortage of them either. That wraps it up for this week's Hackaday podcast. Feel free to email us, editor@hackaday.com. If you'd like to check out the links in the show notes, absolutely do, Hackaday/podcasts. If you see something cool or do something cool, shoot us an email at tips@hackaday.com. And until next week,
keep on hacking. And I'm freshly rebooted too, so.
That's what I like to hear. Any last requests? Final meals? A cigarette?
Blindfold, please.
Am I gonna say it? I guess I am. Cripes.
You got more?
No.
Well, let me try again.